Good evening and welcome back. Settle in, wherever you are. Pull the blanket a little tighter. Let the tea go cool if it wants to. Tonight, we are going somewhere cold and very old. To a place where the wind has names and the names have teeth, and where the gods themselves are not quite immortal, only harder to kill than the rest of us. If you're listening from somewhere with snow on the ground, I want to know. If you're in a city that never quite gets dark, I want to know that too. Leave a word somewhere. Tell me where you are, because tonight's story has a way of finding people, and I think it should know where to look. Tonight, we speak of Freya, not the soft version, not the figure you find on gift shop pendants, goddess of love and flowers, a convenient feminine counterweight to all that masculine thunder. That version exists, and it is not wrong exactly, only incomplete, in the way that describing an ocean as wet is technically accurate and still misses everything that matters. The real Freya, the one encoded in the oldest sources, the one the skalds approached sideways because she was too large to face directly, that Freya is something else. She is desire and death braided together so tightly you cannot find the seam. She is the one who taught the All-Father his most dangerous magic. She wept tears of red gold and rode to the battlefield before Odin's ravens ever arrived. The real Freya chose half of every slain warrior, half. Before Valhalla received its dead, she had already taken hers. We will get to all of this, but to understand Freya, you have to understand the world she was born into, and that world did not begin gently. Before there was anything, there was a gap. This is the beginning the Norse preserved. Not a void exactly, but a space between, a chasm the old sources call Ginnungagap, the yawning void, or perhaps better rendered as the magically charged emptiness, which is a translation that takes a certain academic courage to commit to, but which captures something the blander version misses. It was not nothingness. Nothingness, they understood, is a concept requiring a mind to conceive it, and there were no minds yet. Ginnungagap was pure potential, a held breath between realms that did not yet exist. To the north, ice formed and kept forming. This was Niflheim, the world of mist and cold, where 11 rivers poured from a spring called Ymir and ran until they froze into layer upon layer of rime. The rivers had names: Svöl, Gunthro, Fjorm, Fimbulthul, names like small weather events, names that suggested the rivers had opinions about where they were going. They poured and they froze, and the ice accumulated, and the accumulated ice breathed cold outward into the gap, like the exhalation of something massive and patient and not yet alive. To the south, fire, Muspelheim, the world of fire, whose sparks and embers drifted northward into the gap where they met the rising cold mist from Niflheim. Where fire met ice, something unexpected happened. Not destruction, not cancellation, but transformation. The ice melted, and the meltwater quickened, and from that quickening came something that was not yet a being, but was moving in the direction of one. His name was Ymir. He is called the first of the frost giants, And that is true, but it does not convey the scale of him. Ymir was not a giant the way we mean the word. He was not a tall man, or even a very tall man. He was the first coherent shape the universe managed to produce, and the universe, having taken this long to produce anything at all, was not being modest about it. When Ymir sweated, beings formed from the sweat of his armpit, the first male and female of the frost giants, born from nothing more intentional than the body heat of something colossal. When he slept, his feet found each other, and together they generated another giant, born from that unconscious congress of limbs. The world was beginning, and beginning messy. A cow also formed from the meeting of ice and warmth, Audhumla, from whom 4 rivers of milk ran to sustain Ymir. What sustained Audhumla was the salt in the ice, which she licked with a vast tongue, and on the first day of her licking, she uncovered hair. On the second day, she uncovered a head. By the third day, she had revealed an entire being, a man named Buri, who was beautiful, as the sources specify, and strong, and the first of what would become the Aesir gods. There is something in this creation story that resists the tidy theologies. The Norse did not have a god who spoke the world into existence from outside it. Their world was a collision, a physical, almost chemical reaction between heat and cold that produced mess before it produced order, and the order, when it came, was imposed by violence on what already existed rather than brought into being from nothing. This matters. The world the Norse gods inhabit was never made for them. It was remade by them, from the body of something older and wilder, and that remade world always bore the memory of what it was before. Buri had a son called Bor. Bor took as his wife Bestla, daughter of the frost giants, the blood of Ymir's line. From this union, which was already a bridge across the great divide between what would become the gods and what would become their enemies, came 3 sons. The eldest was Odin, the second was Vili, the third was Ve. These 3 looked at Ymir and made a decision. The decision was not made from fear, or not primarily. It was made from the particular clarity of beings who understand that they are new, and that the old thing that preceded them will not simply move aside. Ymir was the origin of the frost giants, and the frost giants were multiplying in the way that things multiply when no one has yet decided they shouldn't. The 3 brothers killed Ymir, and so much blood poured from his wounds that nearly all the frost giants drowned in it. 2 survived, Bergelmir and his wife, who escaped on a boat, or perhaps on a hollowed tree. The sources disagree on the vessel, but not on the survival. They would go on to repopulate the frost giant line. The blood that drowned the others became the seas. From Ymir's flesh the brothers made the earth. From his bones, mountains. From his teeth and the fragments of bone, stones and pebbles. From his blood and the drowning of his kin, the ocean. From his skull, the sky. They carried his skull to the 4 corners of what was becoming the world, and set it overhead, and at each corner placed a dwarf, Northri, Southri, Austri, Vestri, north, south, east, west, holding it up. The sparks and embers from Muspelheim they caught and fixed in the skull sky as stars, some stationary, some given paths to travel. From Ymir's brains they made the clouds. This is the detail that stays with me, that I cannot quite put down when I try to walk away from this cosmology. The clouds are made from the thoughts of the first being, the original consciousness of the universe, shredded and scattered across the sky, where they drift and reshape themselves endlessly. Every time you have looked at a cloud and thought it looked like something, like a face, like a country, like an animal about to run, you were seeing the residual patterning of the oldest mind that ever existed, still trying to think itself back into coherence. Or the Norse understood meteorology in a different register, and I am letting the poetry run ahead of me. Both things can be true. The world the brothers built from Ymir was called Midgard, the middle enclosure, the place set aside for a new kind of being they had not yet made, but were apparently planning. Around Midgard, they set Ymir's eyebrows as a wall to keep out the frost giants who still prowled beyond, angry about the flooding and the murder of their progenitor, nursing a grudge that would take centuries to ripen into Ragnarok. Inside the wall, Odin and his brothers found 2 trees. Some say ash and elm, some say ash and alder, fallen on the land near the sea, inert and purposeless. They gave the trees gifts. Odin gave breath and life. Vili gave wit and feeling. V gave hearing and sight, and speech and good color. The first humans, Ask and Embla, man and woman, they were given Midgard as their home, and they would live there, beneath the skull sky, walking on the ground that was Ymir's flesh, drinking from water that was his blood, feeling the clouds, his former thoughts, drift overhead, never knowing any of this. The Norse did not seem to find this disturbing. Or if they did, they found it disturbing in the productive way, the way that generates mythology rather than the way that generates despair. Above Midgard, the ash tree Yggdrasil, the world tree, the cosmic spine, connected all the 9 worlds, its roots reaching into different realms, its branches so vast that an eagle perched at the top could not see the serpent gnawing at its base. The tree was always in a state of being partially destroyed and partially renewed. A goat bit its shoots. A stag grazed its leaves. The serpent Nidhogr gnawed its roots. Squirrels ran up and down its trunk, carrying insults between the eagle at the top and the serpent below, because even the cosmic architecture had interpersonal drama built into it. This is the world Freya was born into. Not born into, exactly. She belonged to a different branch of divinity than the Aesir who built it, and the story of how she came to inhabit Asgard alongside them is itself a story of war and its peculiar aftermath, which is what all aftermaths are. The Aesir were not the only gods. This is important, and the myths handle it in an interesting way, not by resolving it, but by living with it. There were 2 families of gods, the Aesir, led by Odin, warrior gods, sky gods, the gods of fate and death, and the ordered violence of civilization. And the Vanir, a different, older tribe of divinity, gods of fertility and the sea, and the magic that comes from the earth rather than the sky, gods whose relationship to death was about return rather than glory. They had coexisted for whatever passed as time in the early world at a respectful and suspicious distance. The war started, as wars often do, with a woman. Her name was Gulveig, golden drink or gold power or gold greed, depending on how you translate it. And she was a Vanir witch, a practitioner of Seiðr, the prophetic and transformative magic the Vanir understood and the Aesir feared. She came to Asgard, some say to corrupt the Aesir, with desire for gold. Some say simply to spread her influence. Some say she was sent deliberately to provoke what followed. The Aesir killed her. They speared her and burned her. She rose from the fire. They killed her again and burned her again. She rose again. 3 times they burned Gulveig. 3 times she rose. After the 3rd burning, she took a new name, Seiðr, brightness or honor, and she became the most celebrated of seeresses, welcomed in every hall. The Aesir had not destroyed her. They had, through their repeated attempts at destruction, created something indestructible. She wandered, practicing her magic, beloved wherever she went. The Vanir considered Gulveig's treatment an act of war. The Aesir seemed to agree, or at least were not inclined to apologize. Spears were thrown. And the wall of Asgard was breached. Both sides won and lost by turns, until they reached the exhausted equilibrium that looks like wisdom when you're tired enough. They made peace, and they sealed the peace in the old way, by exchange of hostages. The Vanir sent 2 hostages to Asgard. One was Njörður, god of the sea, father of the next 2. The other was his son Freyr, or rather, they sent Freya and his twin sister. Her name was Freya. She came to Asgard as a hostage, as a diplomatic pledge, as a piece of a peace treaty between divine families. She came with Freya at her side, and her father Njord's blessings, and the weight of the Vanir tradition in her hands, which meant she carried something the Aesir wanted very much, even as they were suspicious of wanting it. She was not a prisoner. Hostages of this kind in the ancient world were guests of honor and also insurance against betrayal, treated well, because the moment they were treated badly, the treaty they embodied would dissolve. She walked into Asgard, and she stayed. She had a husband when she arrived. Some sources name him Odin, a shadowy figure whose name is suspiciously close to Odin's, which has generated centuries of scholarly argument about whether they are the same figure, viewed differently, or distinct beings who share a name for reasons the sources do not explain. With Odin, she had 2 daughters, Hnoss, whose name means treasure or jewel, and Gersemi, whose name means something similar, treasure again, or precious thing. The daughters appear briefly in the sources and then recede. They were beautiful, we are told, more beautiful than anything that existed, so beautiful that the word for precious thing derives from their names. Then Odin left. He wandered. The sources do not explain why. They rarely explain why people go. They only record the going and its effects. Freya searched for him. She traveled through strange lands weeping, and where her tears fell on earth, They became veins of red gold, and where her tears fell on the sea, they became amber. She found him, eventually, in some versions. She did not find him in others. The marriage, or whatever it was, seems to have been a complicated arrangement that the mythology does not fully resolve, which is either a failure of the transmission or an accurate representation of how things that are complicated tend to remain complicated regardless of how divine you are. What is certain is this: Freya stayed in Asgard. She received a hall called Sessrumnir, many seats or seat room, in the field Folkvangr, the field of the host or people's field. And it was to this field that half of all the dead warriors came. Half, not the lesser half, not the overflow from Valhalla. Half, equally. Odin chose first in some tellings, Freya in others. And the mythology is comfortable with this ambiguity in a way that academic interpreters sometimes are not. The two divine claims on the war dead were parallel, not hierarchical. Or if they were hierarchical, the hierarchy shifted depending on which skald was singing and which patron he was hoping to impress. This is where Freya's story really begins, because this detail, the choosing of the dead, is the detail that unlocks everything else about her. The Aesir settled into their new configuration. Odin took his high seat, Hlidskjalf, from which he could see all 9 worlds, and from this throne he practiced the work of knowing, which was also the work of worrying, because all sight is not the same as all understanding, and Odin saw much that he could not change and much that he was trying to arrange against the day he would need to. He gathered his Einherjar, the dead warriors in Valhalla, training for Ragnarok, and he fed his ravens and his wolves, and he hung himself on the world tree for 9 days to gain the runes, and he gave one of his eyes to the well of Ymir for a single drink of knowledge, and he still could not see everything he needed to see. He went to Freya. She knew Seiðr. The Vanir brought it with them, this deep, transformative magic that operates on fate itself, not the fire and force magic of the Aesir that bends the physical world, but something subtler, older, that reaches into the woven structure of what is going to happen and adjusts the thread before the event arrives. Seiðr could be practiced from a high seat, from a trance state, from outside the frame of normal consciousness, and it required a kind of permeability to the world's underlying currents that the sky gods of Asgard apparently struggled with. They had power, they had authority. What they did not have was this specific sensitivity, this ability to sit at the loom of fate and read the pattern. Freya taught Odin. This is stated plainly in the Ynglinga saga. She taught him Seiðr, and therefore the Aesir were able to get foreknowledge of the fate of men and of things to come. The most powerful magic in the Norse universe was taught by the Vanir goddess to the god of wisdom, because wisdom, the sources seem to suggest, was incomplete without the magic of the women who had been practicing it long before wisdom got to Asgard. The teaching was not without complication. Seiðr was considered ergi, unmanly, unmanning, a practice associated with the passive role in sex in a culture that had very specific anxieties about such things. For Odin to practice Seiðr was to accept a kind of social cost, a mark against his masculine identity that his enemies would later throw at him, and that he seemed to absorb with the particular equanimity of someone who has decided that the power is worth the insult. He was called Aegir by Loki during their famous fighting, and he did not deny it. He had chosen knowledge over respectability. Freya had no such problem. The magic was hers before it was anyone else's, and the categories of its gendering had been organized around its female practitioners. She sat at the high seat and saw what was coming. She offered her services, if services is the right word, which it probably is not. She prophesied when she chose to, in exchange for what she determined was appropriate exchange. She was not Odin's court prophet. She was a separate power in her own domain, who taught the All-Father what he needed and retained for herself the deeper art. Thor was there too, filling a different function, the muscle of divine will, the hammer wielder who kept the giants from overrunning the borders of Asgard and Midgard both. Huge, red-bearded, uncomplicated, in his loves and his rages, Thor was the god of the ordinary people, in a way Odin never quite was. Odin was the god of kings and warriors, and those who sought wisdom in dangerous places, but Thor was the god of the farmers, who needed the rains to come and the lightning not to burn the barns. He wore his power simply. He drank too much, fought too readily, sometimes had to be dressed as a woman to retrieve his stolen hammer, and took this as a temporary inconvenience rather than an existential crisis. Loki was there. Loki defies summary, which is probably intentional on his part if we attribute intention to mythological figures in the way the myths themselves sometimes do. He was bound to Odin by blood brotherhood, an oath so old it predated Asgard's current configuration. He was handsome and shape-shifting and brilliant, and without the specific kind of loyalty that keeps brilliance from becoming destructive. He helped the gods as often as he complicated their plans, usually because his complications were what created the need for his help in the first place. He was the fire that was useful until the moment it was not, and the threshold between those two states moved without announcement. Tyr was there, one-handed, god of law and the binding oath, who had lost his hand to the wolf Fenrir's jaws in the binding that kept the wolf contained, a sacrifice of body for the sake of the cosmic order, the hand given as pledge and then not returned when the pledge proved a deception, and Tyr absorbing this without becoming chaos himself, which is what law actually is. Balder was there, beautiful Balder, whose death was coming in a way that most of the gods knew and none of them could prevent, who shone in Asgard like something borrowed from a better world. Hörð, his blind brother, who would be the instrument without being the cause. Heimdall at the Bifrost, watchful, with eyesight that reached to the ends of the world, and hearing so acute he could hear the grass growing. And Freya, in Folkvangr, receiving her dead. She had her hall and her cats. 2 cats drew her chariot, great grey beasts, their names sometimes given as Beigel and Tregel, though the sources are sparse on this. And she had her falcon cloak, a garment made of falcon feathers that allowed its wearer to fly, which she sometimes lent to Loki when he needed to travel quickly and she was feeling generous or strategic about it. She had her necklace. The necklace requires its own accounting. Its name was Brisingamen, the Brising necklace, or the necklace of the Brisings, though who the Brisings were is a question the sources manage not to answer with any consistency. It was made by 4 dwarves. This much is consistent across the versions. The dwarves were smiths of the kind who lived in the rock of the earth, below the roots of the world, and whose craft was the making of impossible things. Mjolnir, Odin's spear Gungnir, the chain that bound Fenrir, the golden hair of Sif. When the dwarves made something, it lasted. When they named their price, it was not in gold. Freya came to the dwarves' forge. She saw what they were making. She wanted it, with the specific wanting that moves through you before you have thought about the consequences, the wanting that is itself a kind of knowing, the body recognizing what the mind has not yet processed. She told them she wanted it. She asked what she would have to give. Each dwarf named the same price, one night with Freya. There is a version of this story where she refuses. There is no version of this story that she refuses. What the sources preserve in the Flete Jarbok and implied in other texts is this: she agreed. 4 nights, 4 dwarves, and on the morning of the 5th day, the necklace was hers. She wore it home. Odin found out. In most versions, Loki found out first. Loki shape-shifted into a fly, or into a flea, or simply crept close enough to see, and reported back to Odin, who was in many versions furious in a way that implicates him beyond the authority he claims. He ordered Loki to steal the necklace back. Loki, being Loki, agreed. He returned it to Odin. Odin held it and made Freya a condition. She could have Brisingamen back if she agreed to stir up war among mortals, to incite 2 kings to fight each other perpetually, the fallen rising each night to fight again, a cycle of violence that would only end at Ragnarok. She agreed. She took the necklace back. I need to pause here, because this moment is one of the hinge points of the whole mythology, and it tends to get swept past in summaries that are in a hurry to get to the hammer stories and the dragon slayings. Freya agreed to serve as a kind of instrument of perpetual war among humans in order to reclaim a piece of jewelry. That framing makes it sound like vanity. That framing is wrong, or at least insufficient. Brisingamen was not a trinket. In the mythology, it is consistently associated with her power, her full, complete power, the power that makes her both goddess of desire and goddess of war. Without it, she is diminished. More than that, the necklace appears in later texts, in contexts where it seems to function as a symbol of her sovereignty, the way a crown functions, not a decoration, but an object that concentrates and makes legible what is otherwise diffuse. She paid for it with her body, which in the context of a goddess who has dominion over desire and love and the exchanges of intimacy, is arguably paying in the currency she herself controls, which is different from being coerced in the way a lesser being would be coerced, though the distinction is not clean and the sources do not try to make it clean. She got it back by agreeing to a function she would have exercised anyway. She chose the dead from battlefields. That was her role. Odin's demand was that she make more battlefields, but the role itself was already hers. This is not absolution, it is complication. The myths do not absolve, they complicate, and then they let the complication stand. Let me collect the thread. We have the world made from murder and transformation, the gods who are not infinite, but merely very difficult to kill, the treaty between divine families, sealed by Freya's arrival in Asgard, the magic she carries that the Aesir needed and could not generate on their own, the necklace that is both a story about desire and a story about power and a story about the cost of being the specific thing you are. Now we need the heroes, because the Norse world generated heroes the way Ymir generated frost giants, through a combination of divine interference, mortal necessity, and a deep structural need for figures who could bear the weight of the gap between what humans were and what the gods required them to become. His name was Sigurd, and he was born to die in a specific way at a specific time that the Norns had presumably already woven into the fabric of fate before his mother's labor pains had finished. This is not a figure of speech. The Norse Norns, Urða, Verðandi, Skuld, what was, what is becoming, what shall be, sat at the roots of Yggdrasil and wove, and what they wove happened, and not even the gods could fully unweave what they had set. When Sigurd was born, he was already a thread in the pattern, already committed to his trajectory. He was born to Hjördis, daughter of a king, and Sigmundr, the last of the Volsungs, who had already lived a story so dense with fate and violence and divine interference that his son's story reads almost as an aftermath, a cleaning up, except that it is its own catastrophe. Sigmundr died before Sigurd was born. He died with Odin's interference. Odin appeared on the battlefield and shattered Sigmundr's sword with his spear, not because he had abandoned Sigmundr, but because Sigmundr's time was complete, which is a distinction that satisfies in theology and devastates in practice. The sword shattered, Sigmundr died. Hjördis collected the pieces and carried them, and the child growing in her, to safety. Sigurd was born in exile, raised by a smith named Regin, who was more than a smith. Regin was the son of a man called Hreidmar, and his brother was Fafnir, who had once been a man and was now a dragon. This transformation had been paid for in the old way. Odin and Loki and Honir had killed Otr, another of Hreidmar's sons, thinking Otr was a beaver and finding out too late that Otr was a man who enjoyed swimming in animal form. As compensation, they paid a ransom of gold, the cursed gold of Andvari, a dwarf from whom Loki had seized it, and Andvari had placed on it a curse as he gave it up, because the helpless always curse what they cannot hold. The gold passed to Hreidmar. Fafnir killed Hreidmar to get the gold. Fafnir took the gold to a heath and lay down on top of it and stayed there so long, so consumed by the need to possess it and not be taken from it, that he became what his worst self had always been. He became a dragon. Regin, the surviving brother, did not inherit the gold or the curse, but inherited instead the purpose the curse left behind. He would raise a hero to kill his brother and take the gold. He raised Sigurd. He taught him everything he knew, and some things he perhaps shouldn't have. He reforged Sigmundar's shattered sword. Gram it was called, the sword that had been a god's gift before it was a man's and before it was fragments, and Sigurd tested it on the forge's anvil and split it to the floor, which was the test. Regin taught Sigurd the runes and the languages of birds and the deep craft of the smith, and all the time underneath the teaching ran the current of Regin's purpose, which was not Sigurd's flourishing, but his own revenge and his own gold. Sigurd knew this, or suspected it, which amounts to the same thing when you are a hero, and knowing changes nothing about the trajectory. But before Fafnir, there was a king to kill, and before the king, there was the living fact of being Sigurd in a world that had decided he was significant. He was raised in a hall. He ate at the same table as Regin every morning and heard the same stories. Regin was a careful teacher, patient in the way that people with long horizons are patient, willing to circle back to the same lessons until the student's body understood them before the student's mind did. He taught Sigurd the history of the Volsungs, which was a history of people who had burned and not been consumed, who had been buried and escaped, who had loved and destroyed in that particular circular pattern where love and destruction become difficult to distinguish. He taught Sigurd who he came from. Knowing your lineage in the Norse world was not vanity. It was orientation, the way knowing which direction the North Star sits gives you all the other directions by default. Sigurd grew into the kind of man about whom other men became careful, not cruel. There is nothing in the sources that reads as cruelty in him, which is unusual for a hero of this scale. He was precise. He understood violence as a tool with specific applications, and he applied it specifically, which is different from the berserker tradition of abandoning the discriminating self entirely and becoming a weapon. He discriminated. He killed what needed killing and moved on. He acquired the horse Grani first, because a hero without a worthy horse is a man walking, and the Norse were precise about the difference. Grani was the offspring of Odin's horse Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse, the finest horse that ever existed, born from Loki in mare form after a complicated episode involving a giant stallion and a lost bet about Asgard's walls. Grani had that lineage in his legs. When Sigurd chose him from a herd of horses by driving them all into a river and selecting the one that emerged ready to run, he was selecting divine speed and something that could carry him through what was coming. He killed a gang of kings who had murdered his father first, which the sources include almost as preamble, as if it were a formality to be observed before the real work began. He was thorough about it. He was not theatrical. He did what was required and moved on, which is either admirable discipline or a troubling efficiency, depending on how you are sitting with the story at this particular moment. Then he went to Fafnir. Regin told him to dig a pit on the dragon's path and lie in it, and stab upward as the dragon passed overhead. A sensible plan that Sigurd was implementing when an old man appeared and suggested he dig multiple pits to let the blood drain away rather than drowning in it. The old man had one eye. He did not stay long. The advice was good. Sigurd lay in the pit. Fafnir passed overhead, breathing darkness and avarice, and the particular cold of something that has been still for so long it has forgotten motion. Sigurd thrust upward with Gram, into the soft place beneath the left shoulder where a dragon's heart sits if you know to look, and Fafnir fell dying beside the path. The dying took a while, as it does with dragons, and Fafnir used the time to speak. He told Sigurd that the gold was cursed. He told him that every man who touched it would be destroyed by it. He told him this, not with the satisfaction of revenge, but with what sounds, in the sources, almost like relief, the unburdening of something long held that no longer needed holding. Sigurd asked him why he had bothered, if he knew. He did not wait for the answer, or the answer is not preserved. He cut out Fafnir's heart and began to roast it. While the heart cooked, he burned his thumb, testing it for doneness, and put his thumb in his mouth, and the dragon's blood touched his tongue, and everything changed. He could understand the birds. The birds in the tree above him were discussing whether he should trust Regin, and their consensus, stated with the directness of creatures who do not have the social vocabulary for softening a message, was that he should not. Regin was planning to kill him and take the gold and the heart. Regin's own fate was woven. Sigurd cut off Regin's head before Regin could move, and ate Fafnir's heart, and took the cursed gold, and rode on. He rode to a mountain surrounded by fire, and found something on the other side of the fire that looked like an armored warrior asleep. He removed the armor and found a woman. Her name was Brynhilda. She was a Valkyrie, one of Odin's battle choosers, the women who rode above the field deciding who died and who survived. She had disobeyed Odin. She had granted victory to the wrong king, the one Odin had decided should lose, and for this act of independent judgment, Odin had plunged her into a sleep from which she could only be woken by a man who did not know fear. The fire was to ensure that only the right kind arrived. Sigurd woke her, and they fell into the kind of love that the Norse understood as simultaneously the best possible thing and the beginning of the end. She taught him. He swore oaths. He left to seek glory elsewhere, because a hero who stops moving is no longer quite a hero, and the promises they made to each other were absolute and would therefore be absolutely violated, because that is how absolute promises function in a mythological universe where fate has already decided what happens and is only waiting for the humans to catch up. Brynhilda spoke first. When she woke, she spoke runes and counsel and the knowledge of things she had accumulated in the centuries she had been sleeping, which had apparently not been empty for her the way sleep is empty for the living. She knew things about fate, and about Sigurd's fate specifically, and she told him some of them. She did not tell him everything. Perhaps she could not. Perhaps she chose not to. The sources leave this open, and it is the kind of openness that rewards sitting with rather than resolving. They swore oaths. The oath swearing in the Norse tradition was not a formality. It was the most binding action available to a person, more binding than law, more binding than kinship, because oath-breaking was the precise mechanism by which the gods themselves would fail at Ragnarök. The oath was the thread that held the fabric together. When Sigurd and Brynhildr swore to each other, they were placing themselves inside a structure that the universe would enforce, which neither of them fully understood, and which the cursed gold in Sigurd's saddlebag was already working to undermine. What happened is complicated and involves a second woman named Gudrun and a cursed drink that erased Sigurd's memory of Brynhildr, and a marriage and a second oath and a competition between queens about whose husband was superior that escalated in the specific way that arguments escalate when the stakes are everything and neither party is wrong about what they're owed. Brynhildr orchestrated Sigurd's death. Sigurd died, and Brynhildr, having gotten what she said she wanted, found that she had not wanted this at all, and she threw herself on his funeral pyre, and they burned together. And some said that in the smoke one could see them riding side by side toward whatever waited after, the sword Gram placed between them on the pyre, as it had been placed between them in earlier, stranger nights when the oath was still something to be kept. The gold went to his killers. His killers were destroyed by it. The curse worked out. Before we continue with Freya's catalogue of selves, we should say something about the structure of time the Norse inhabited, because time in their framework was not the uniform progression we treat as obvious. It was layered, it was eroding, it moved toward a known destination the way a river moves toward the sea, gathering speed and debris as it goes. The mythology does not give us a codified series of ages, the way Hesiod's framework gives us gold, silver, bronze, heroic, and iron. But it gives us something functionally equivalent, a sense that the world began in a state of divine possibility and has been moving, with occasional reversals, toward Ragnarök, and that the moving itself changes the quality of what is possible. The gods, in their earliest interactions with humans, were present in a way they gradually became less present. Odin walked among men, disguised, testing, advising. The Aesir and the Vanir were closer to the world that bore them. The connection between divine and human was more permeable. As the ages accumulated, the connection attenuated. Not all at once. There were always heroes, always moments of divine intervention, always the occasional mortal who managed to drink from the well, or hang on the tree, or receive the gift of the sword that fights itself. But the general movement was toward greater distance, toward a world where the gods were increasingly the subjects of myth rather than the agents of history, where you heard about them rather than meeting them on the road. This is the Norse version of the Golden Age's decline. Not a series of discrete metallic stages, but a gradual erosion of the sacred proximity, the divine accessibility that characterized the beginning. And this erosion is connected to what the giants represent: the old chaos pressing at the borders, the entropy that divine order can slow but not reverse, the slow working through of whatever Ymir's murder introduced into the cosmological fabric. Freya, within this framework, is one of the primary nodes of connection. The Seiðr she practices is explicitly about maintaining permeability. The trance opens the practitioner to what is usually closed, makes legible what is usually encoded, keeps the channel between ordinary human perception and the deeper fabric of fate from closing entirely. In a world where the gods are becoming myths, the seeress, who can still reach into the mythological layer and pull something real out of it, is doing essential maintenance work. She had another name in those early days that some sources preserve and others do not. She was sometimes called Vanadis, Dis of the Vanir, where Dis meant a kind of female being with power over fate, and to call her this was to locate her precisely at the intersection of death, magic, and the feminine power of foreknowledge. She was the Vanir's representative of that category of beings, the chief of those who see. Her other great instrument of perception was the boar Hildisvíni, whose name meant battle pig, which is a name that only works in a universe where animals are understood to embody qualities rather than merely possess them. Hildisvíni was golden bristled and ran beside or beneath her, and the boar was sacred to her in the way that particular animals carry the essence of divine portfolios. The wolf carried wildness and Odin's hunger, the raven carried memory and the dead. The boar in Freya's case carried the particular combination of fierceness and fecundity, the productive violence of things that dig in the earth and create by destroying. She rode it into battle, some say, when she did not ride the cats. The Seiðr seat from which she practiced her magic was a high platform, and she sat on it in a kind of trance. Her awareness dispersed into the currents of fate, and what came back to her she could translate into prophecy, into counsel, into the specific actionable intelligence that separated the god who survived the next century from the god who did not. She was consulted, not always by Odin. She had her own queue of petitioners, her own cache of knowledge that she released or withheld according to her own judgment. She wept red gold for Other, who was gone, who kept going. The nature of his going is not clear. Some say he was one of those wanderers for whom the condition of wandering is more essential than any specific destination or reason, who leave not because they are pushed, but because stillness is a kind of dying for them. Some say there was something he was looking for, a specific absence that sent him outward. The gold her weeping produced was real. The amber the sea tears became was real and washed up on shores, and was found by people who did not know they were holding the solidified grief of a goddess. She searched. She traveled under disguises and aliases, which is a detail the sources include without much elaboration, but which suggests something about both the scope of her searching and the complexity of her situation. A goddess traveling in disguise is doing something she does not want to be seen doing, or traveling through places where being known would complicate the passage. She searched and found, and lost and found again, and the ambiguity of whether she ever truly reclaimed what she had lost is preserved in the mythology as ambiguity, which is to say, it is preserved as truth. Among the Valkyries, she had a particular relationship as their de facto foremother in that capacity, and they require their own accounting, though I will give them less space than I could. This is one of those moments where a story branches into 10 stories and you have to choose the branch or lose the main road. The Valkyries were women, some of the goddesses adjacent, and some the daughters of kings, and some harder to categorize, who rode above the battlefield with the specific authority to choose. They were sometimes described as being present in the birds above the field, ravens, in some accounts, watching and deciding. Sometimes they appeared as women in armor, riding horses through the carnage, touching a warrior on the shoulder or looking past him, and the touch meant he was chosen, and the looking past meant he was not. They were beautiful in the way that things with complete authority over your fate sometimes appear to you in dreams, too composed, too present, the composure itself a kind of warning. Their names were programs: Göndul, magic wand; Sjögul, shaker; Hildur, battle; Hrund, test; Geirskjögul, spear shaker; Göl, noise; Sigrun, victory rune. They were named for what they did and what they embodied, named the way weapons are named, not the way people are. And yet they had interiority in the mythology. Brynhilda was a Valkyrie, and what happened to her was a fully human tragedy, despite her divine origin, which may be the point, or one of the points. Freya presided over their function in Folkvangr. She did not command them exactly. The sources are loose about the organizational structure, but she was their precedent, their archetype, the goddess who had done what they did, but at a vaster scale and with a vaster authority. When a Valkyrie chose a warrior, she was enacting something that Freya had established. Freya also taught the magic, not just Odin. The Valkyries themselves, in some tellings, knew Seiðr, and their ability to shape the battlefield outcome was not purely physical or organizational, but magical, a reaching into the weave to find the thread that should be pulled. This knowledge came from the Vanir tradition, which came through Freya, which is why the lineage matters, even when lineages feel like academic footnotes. She was the source. Before we go further, let me say something about Thor and the dress, because it is connected to Freya in a way that most retellings skip past, and the connection is the interesting part. Thor woke one morning to find Mjolnir gone. Mjolnir, crusher, the hammer that kept the giants from overrunning the borders, the weapon that was also a tool for blessing, for sanctifying, for marking the sacred, had been stolen by Thrymr, king of the frost giants, who had buried it 8 fathoms underground and would return it only in exchange for Freya as his bride. Loki and Thor went to Freya with this information. She refused. The sources give her this moment of cold fury, a rage so intense that the walls of Asgard shook and her necklace fell from her neck. Brisingamen rattled loose from the force of her anger, which is a detail I find remarkable, that her rage was physical and the necklace was its most visible symptom. She was not a payment. She was not a trade. She was not the bride of some giant who had committed theft to bargain his way to a woman he could not otherwise have. The gods needed another plan. Loki's plan was that Thor should dress as the bride. Thor's resistance was predictable and futile because the resistance of gods to dressing as women is consistently overcome by the pragmatic reality that Mjolnir needed to come back. He wore the veil and the dress and the keys at his belt and Freya's necklace, because even this plan involved borrowing Brisingamen, which Freya apparently consented to in this context, where the necklace would serve to undermine the giant's plan rather than serve his desire. Loki went as the handmaiden. The scene at Thrymm's hall is played for comedy in the Thrym and it deserves to be. Thor eating an ox, 8 salmon, all the dainties prepared for the women, washing it down with 3 horns of mead, while Loki explained to Thrym that the bride had not eaten in 8 days from longing. Thor's eyes burning red beneath the veil, Loki explaining that the bride's eyes were fierce from 8 nights of longing. Thrym reaching for the bride's breast and finding something unexpected. When Mjolnir was brought forward to bless the bride, Thor's hand closed on its handle and the comedy ended. The hall was destroyed. The giants were dead. Mjolnir came home. The story is funny. It is also, in its structure, a story about what happens when a woman refuses to be used as a tool of exchange, even by the gods who need something from her. The plan only worked because Freya said no, because her no was absolute enough that a workaround had to be found, and the workaround was so absurd that it preserved the hammer while simultaneously demonstrating the absurdity of the original demand. The giant wanted Freya. He got Thor in a dress and his hall on fire. There is a kind of justice in this that the myth does not editorialize about, but allows the structure itself to communicate. Anyway, the wars between the gods and the giants were not episodic conflicts. They were the rhythm of the Norse universe, the constant pressure at the borders of order, the reminder that the world the gods built from Ymir's body was maintained by ongoing effort rather than established once and sustained automatically. The giants were not evil in any clean categorical sense. They were older. They had a grievance going back to the flooding of their ancestors, and they were what the gods were not. They were the world's first content, the raw material of reality, imperfectly subdued, always testing the edges of the arrangement. Freya occupied a specific position in this ongoing tension. She was the one being in Asgard who combined the Aesir and Vanir traditions in her person. She had come as a hostage, but stayed as something more integrated than that, and she practiced magic from a tradition older than the Aesir sky worship, a magic of the earth and the sea and the deep agricultural cycles that the frost giants' cold threatened directly. Her power over fertility was not separate from her power over the dead. Both were about what the earth gives and takes. Both were about the cycle that the giants' eternal winter would stop. She was, in the cosmological architecture, one of the reasons the world had not yet ended. This is not a small thing. There was a builder once who came to the gods with an offer. He would rebuild the walls of Asgard, walls that had been breached in the war with the Vanir and never fully repaired, and he would do it in one winter, finishing before the first day of summer, and his price was the sun and the moon and Freya as his wife. The gods deliberated. Loki persuaded them to accept, with the caveat that the builder must work alone and without any man's help, which seemed to make the condition impossible and therefore safe. The builder agreed, but kept a condition of his own. He could use his horse, Svadilfari. The horse was more than a horse. It was supernatural in its capacity, in the way it could haul stones that no animal should have been able to haul, stones the size of mountains, stones that would have taken 100 men, and the wall grew at a rate that frightened the gods. With 3 days left before summer, the wall was nearly done. The gods were about to lose Freya and the light of the world. They turned to Loki with the specific fury of gods who have let someone else solve their problems and are now confronting the consequences. Loki shape-shifted into a mare and led Svadilfari away from the work. Without the horse, the builder could not finish. He revealed himself as a mountain giant. They had not asked his lineage when they made the deal, and Thor killed him. The wall was mostly built. The deal was void. Loki, in the shape of a mare, became pregnant by Svadilfari. He gave birth to Sleipnir, the 8-legged horse, who became Odin's horse and the finest horse in any world. The detail about Freya is this: she was the stake. Again, she was what the giant wanted, and again she was not consulted, and again the resolution of the crisis involved Loki's bizarre metamorphic adventures rather than her direct participation, and again she did not end up in the giant's hall. The pattern of these attempted trades, Thrymr, the builder, is not accidental. The mythology returns to Freya as a target of giant desire with enough regularity to constitute a structural pattern, and the consistent failure of these attempts constitutes a structural assertion. This is not a thing that can be taken. She was desired because she embodied what the giants could not have, and what the gods could not afford to lose. Fertility, magic, the choosing of the dead, the connection to the Vanir traditions that the Aesir needed and could not generate independently. To take Freya would be to take a principle. The stories know this, even when they dress it as a bride price negotiation. She moved through a world full of her own reflections. Every seeress who sat on a high platform and spoke what the currents of fate told her was practicing Seiðr in Freya's tradition. Every woman who placed the image of a boar on her helmet before battle, and they did. The bracteates and the artifacts show this. The boar-crested helmets and the boar imagery that recurs through the archaeological record of the Germanic peoples was invoking something of what Freya carried. Every amber bead found in a grave, strung on a wire, worn at the throat of someone who would not see another spring, was in some sense one of her tears, given solid form by the sea. The connection to amber is worth pausing on, though we cannot pause long. Amber, in the ancient world, was understood as a substance of mysterious origin. It came from the sea, some of it washing up on the shores of the Baltic and the North Sea, and it had the strange property of attracting small things when rubbed, which we now understand as static electricity, and which the ancients understood as alive, as charged with something invisible. It was used in trade routes that reached from the Baltic shores to the Mediterranean, centuries before the Viking Age. The Greeks called it electron. The Norse called the sea by one of its names, Freya's tears. And this is not a minor poetic flourish. It is a cosmological claim that the ocean's gift of this particular precious material was grief gold, divine sorrow made portable and beautiful. When traders carried amber south along the rivers, of what is now Russia and Poland, and down to the cities of the Mediterranean, they were carrying, in some sense, the residue of a goddess's grief for a wandering husband. The Norse did not make this claim loudly or frequently. It is encoded in the naming, in the etymology, in the way certain associations persist in a tradition long after the people practicing the tradition can tell you where the association came from. The death of Balder sits at the center of the Norse mythology like a stone dropped in still water, the rings spreading outward through everything that follows. Balder, Odin's son, the beautiful one, the beloved one, the one whose death the sources signal from nearly the beginning of any comprehensive retelling, died not from battle or age or the direct malice of a giant, but from mistletoe, thrown by his blind brother's hand, aimed by Loki. His mother Frigg had extracted promises from everything in the world not to harm Balder, from fire, from water, from iron, from all the metals, from stones, from earth, from trees, from sicknesses, from all the animals, from all the serpents. She had missed mistletoe, thinking it too young or too unimportant, and Loki had found it, and fashioned from it a dart, and guided Höðr's hand. Freya's relationship to this death is oblique in the sources. She and Frigg are sometimes confused with each other, the two major goddess figures of the Norse canon, both powerful, both connected to love and fate, sometimes appearing to share attributes, and sometimes appearing to be distinct and even opposed. The question of whether they were originally the same figure who split, or always distinct figures who accumulated similar characteristics, is a scholarly argument that has not resolved. What the mythology gives us is two separate figures who occupy adjacent but different positions. Frigg, the wife of Odin, the mother, the keeper of a different kind of foresight that she does not share. Freya, the Vanir arrival, the witch, the chooser of the dead. When Balder died, and Hel received him, Hel, the daughter of Loki, ruler of the realm of the ordinary dead, not the warrior's death hall, but the place where those who died of sickness and age and accident were sorted. When Balder went to Hel's cold realm, the world grieved visibly. The gods wept, the animals wept, the stones wept, the trees wept, everything wept except for one giantess named Thatch, or Thanks, who refused, and because all things had to weep for Balder to return from Hel, and because Thok would not, Balder stayed in Hel. Loki, the sources imply, was Thok in disguise, and here the thread of blame and consequence pulled tight. Loki had been useful for too long to be punished, and then he had done too much to be forgiven, and the balance finally tipped at a feast where he walked in uninvited and said everything true and unforgivable about everyone present. The long, slick speech of someone who has stored up grievances in the form of knowledge and is now spending all of it at once. He accused Freya of things. He said she had slept with every god and elf in the hall, and Freya answered him without flinching, which is a woman who has made her choices and is not interested in defending them to Loki. He accused her of betrayal and inconstancy. She answered him again. The flighting continued, this formal exchange of insults that was also a kind of combat, the words as weapons tradition of a culture that understood that language could wound as precisely as iron. He was caught after. He was bound with the entrails of his son Narfi, bound to 3 rocks in a cave, a serpent placed above him to drip venom onto his face. The pain was constant and volcanic. When he writhed, the earth shook, and that is what earthquakes are. His wife Sigyn sat beside him with a bowl, catching the venom before it fell. When the bowl filled, she had to turn to empty it, and in those seconds, the venom hit his face, and he convulsed, and the earth shook. She always returned to the bowl. He would stay there until Ragnarök. The word Ragnarök, the fate of the gods, the doom of the divine, the catastrophe at the end of the age. The word itself is a kind of compression. It contains everything the Norse understood about their mythology's terminal condition, that the gods were not eternal, that the order they had built from Ymir's body was conditional, that the frost giant's patience was simply a function of being imprisoned in their cold realm at the edges of the world and not a change of heart. The Norns had seen it. Odin had hung himself on the tree for 9 nights to read the runes, and what the runes told him about the end was what drove every subsequent gathering of warriors, every Einherjar welcomed to Valhalla, every desperate consultation with prophetesses and dead seers. The signs would come first. Fimble winter, 3 winters in a row, without summer between them, the world freezing in the agricultural sense before the mythological catastrophe arrived. Brother killing brother, the bonds of kinship and loyalty dissolving, the wolf Skull catching the sun, which he had been chasing since the beginning, the wolf Hati catching the moon, stars falling. Jörmungand, the Midgard serpent, releasing the coast he had bitten to hold himself coiled around the world, and rising from the ocean, the tidal waves of his rising, washing over everything. Fenrir, breaking his chains. The gods had bound Fenrir, because Odin knew from prophecy that the wolf would kill him at Ragnarök, and they had tried to change this by binding him, and binding him required Tyr's hand as pledge. Fenrir had agreed to be bound only if one of the gods placed a hand in his jaws as guarantee of good faith, and when the binding held and they would not free him, the wolf closed his jaws on Tyr's hand, and Tyr had known this was coming when he agreed to it, and he agreed anyway. Fenrir was bound and furious for centuries. At Ragnarök, the bound broke. Loki escaped. He sailed with his son Ymir and the frost giants on the ship Naglfar, made from the fingernails and toenails of the dead, which is why the Norse trimmed their nails before death to slow the ship's building, sailed toward Asgard at the head of the giant army. The Bifrost Bridge broke under the weight of Muspel's sons as they crossed. Odin died first among the named gods. Fenrir swallowed him. Vidar avenged him, tearing the wolf's jaws apart or stabbing up into its palate. Thor killed Jörmungand and walked 9 steps away from the body before dying from the serpent's venom. 9 steps, exactly. The sources specify the number, and it is the kind of detail that makes you trust the other details. Freya fell to Surtur because Freya had given away his sword that could fight by itself, the self-fighting sword that would have defended him in the last battle. He had given it to his servant Skirnir in exchange for help in winning the giantess Gertha, whom he had loved from the first moment he looked out from Odin's high seat and saw her in Jotunheimr, her arms so bright they lit the sea and sky. He gave the sword for love and died without it, fighting Surtur with an antler. Loki and Heimdallr killed each other. Surtur set fire to the world with a sword of flame. The earth sank into the sea. Stars fell. The cosmic machinery, held together by divine will and Yggdrasil's roots and the ongoing effort of beings who were not eternal, stopped. This is not the end of the story. The earth rises again, a new earth, green and growing, the falls of water running down from the mountains. The eagle flies above, hunting fish in the rivers. Grain grows that was never sown. Two humans, Leif and Lifthrasir, life and life's will, have survived in Hodmimir's Holt, Mimir's forest, hidden from Surtur's fire. They will repopulate the world. Some of the gods survive or return. Balder and Höður return from Hel, the death of the old world releasing them into the new one. Vidar and Vali survive. Höð, the blind god who threw the mistletoe dart, is there, which is a detail that requires a careful rereading of what culpability means in a world where fate is woven in advance. The sources do not specify with certainty whether Freya is among those who come after. This is the gap in the transmission, or it is intentional, or it is a statement about something the mythology understood about her, that she was the kind of being who existed before the structure that was lost and who would exist in whatever came after, not bounded by the same terminal condition as the gods who built Asgard, because she came from somewhere older. Or she died with the rest of the world, and the new world began without her, and the golden game pieces the gods will find in the grass, the pieces from the game they used to play, scattered in the old world's death, are all that remain. The question the mythology keeps returning to, circling the way water circles a drain, is what it means for something to be desired. Freya was desired by giants who wanted to possess her as a prize, by Oath who loved her and left, by the dwarves who wanted one night each of her company, by the mortals who prayed to her before battle and before marriage and before giving birth. She was desired in every mode that desire takes, and she was not diminished by any of it, which is the mythological argument the stories are trying to make, even when they seem to be making other arguments. The desire of others did not determine her shape. She moved through it the way the sun moves through clouds. The clouds are real. The sun is also real, and neither cancels the other. She was also the one who desired, the searching for Oath, the wanting of Brisingamen, with a wanting so immediate and complete that she traded for it without visible negotiation of the terms. She was not a figure of passive reception. She was not a goddess people prayed to and who merely responded. She moved through the world under her own momentum, making choices that were consequential and that the mythology does not try to make innocent, which is a kind of respect for her that disguises itself as complications. The tears of red gold are the detail I keep returning to, the amber in the sea, the idea that grief could be productive, could generate something beautiful and durable and valuable, not because grief is good, but because grief in the right cosmological conditions, transforms what it touches. She wept, and the earth received gold. She wept, and the sea received amber. The world was more valuable for her having lost something. This is not consolation. It is not an argument for loss being secretly fine. It is a cosmological fact, stated without editorial, that even the grief of a goddess leaves the world richer for its having passed through. There is a word, Seiðr, which we have been calling Seiðr for convenience, and it is worth holding for a moment in the shape it had before it became a footnote in comparative religion textbooks. The Norse understood it as a real operative force, not metaphor and not psychology, but a genuine reaching into the structure of fate. It was practiced from trance, from a high seat, with a staff, with songs called varðlokur, that the practitioner's assistants sang to attract the spirits whose knowledge the seeress needed. The platform elevated the practitioner above the ordinary ground of consensus reality. The trance dissolved the boundary between the practitioner's awareness and the broader field of what has happened and what will happen. What came back through the practitioner was prophecy, which the Norse distinguished carefully from prediction. Prediction says what will happen. Prophecy says what the fabric of fate, as it is presently woven, contains. The distinction is subtle, but it mattered, because it meant that the practitioner was not a calculator, but a reader, reading something that could in principle be read differently by a different practitioner, or that could look different at different moments in the weaving. The Norns were always working. Freya at the high seat was not omniscient. She was the most accomplished practitioner of a method of perception that exceeded ordinary human perception, and her practice of it had taught the All-Father himself. She knew things that other things did not know. She did not know everything. This limitation is important to the Norse sense of what divinity meant. The gods were not omniscient. They had greater power than humans and longer lives and access to forms of knowledge humans could not easily access, but they were embedded in the same fate structure as everything else, and the Norns wove their fates too. What distinguished Freya was not that she stood outside fate, but that she could read further into it than most beings. And what she read, she could sometimes use to alter the approach to an event, even if she could not alter the event's ultimate arrival. She saw Ragnarok coming. Every practitioner who looked far enough saw Ragnarok coming. This did not stop it. The seeing was real, and the event was real, and they did not cancel each other. The Norse were comfortable with this, in a way that other theological systems tend to find intolerable. The archaeology does not give us Freya directly. It gives us her reflections. Gold bracteates, thin stamped gold discs worn as pendants, show figures on horseback, figures with birds, figures in the context of what appears to be Seiðr ritual. Some of these are clearly connected to Odin, some to the Valkyrie tradition, some to a female divine figure that scholars associate with Freya without certainty, because certainty about early medieval Scandinavian religious iconography is a rare thing, and those who claim it are probably oversimplifying. The amber beads in graves, strung as necklaces, appear throughout the Germanic world, and were clearly considered valuable beyond their market price. They were buried with the dead, which means they were considered worth keeping in the next place. The boar helmets. The Benty Grange helmet. The helmet from Sutton Hoo, with its boar figures on the crest. The boar imagery on bracteates and sword hilts, and the armor of people who expected to be in battle and wanted the protection of something divine. The boar was the sacred animal of the Vanir, sacred to Freya and Freya both, and its presence on martial objects is not decorative. It is an invocation, a request, a suit filed with a power whose domain included both battle and what came after battle. The names of places still carry her. In Scandinavia, place names derived from Freya's name appear in Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Frøyel in Gotland, various Frovi names, Frölunda, Fröslunda. These are places where there was presumably once a cult site, a place of worship, a location where the connection between human community and divine patron was maintained through ritual. The place name survived when the rituals did not. The Christianity that came north in the 9th and 10th centuries was thorough about the rituals, but could not rename every farm and fjord. She survived in the day of the week, Friday, Freitag in German, Fredag in the Scandinavian languages, is her day, named from the Proto-Germanic Frijo, which was how the Germanic peoples translated the Roman Venus Day into their own divine calendar. She was matched with Venus as the day's patron, which is an interesting match and an incomplete one. Venus was desire and beauty and the sea's foam and nothing much beyond that, while Freya was all of that and death and magic and the choosing of warriors. But the scribes who made the translation were apparently working with the tools they had. The skalds, who preserved the mythology, were in a difficult position, historically speaking. They were working in a tradition that was already being converted. They were Christian, many of them, or at least nominally Christian, writing down stories from a religion their ancestors had practiced and that their contemporaries were abandoning, trying to preserve something whose preservation made them suspect, using mythological references as poetic conventions, while being genuinely uncertain about how much of the old belief system they were prepared to defend. Snorri Sturluson, who in the 13th century compiled the Prose Edda, the most comprehensive single source for Norse mythology, was a Christian Icelander preserving pagan knowledge as literary heritage, which is a complicated position that inflects every page he wrote. The poetic Edda, older and less tidy, preserved the poems themselves, the Foluspa, which is the Sibyl's prophecy that begins at the beginning and ends at Ragnarök, and is probably the most complete single document statement of Norse cosmological thinking. The Grimnismal, the Skirnismal, the Thrimskvida, the Lokasena, and many others, each from a different source tradition, each preserving a different facet of the same enormous prismatic mythology. Freya appears throughout, and throughout she is not consistent in exactly the way that a real figure is not consistent. Not because the sources contradict each other in ways that suggest error, but because she is a different aspect of herself depending on which context she appears in. which is how beings of genuine complexity actually function. She was written down by people who loved the stories, even when they were ambivalent about the gods. This is a kind of preservation that carries its own shape. Anyway, the Wagner operas came later and made Brünnhilde from Brünnhilde and made it into something about tragic love and heroism and German nationalism and the ring as capitalism, which the Norse would have found bewildering in some respects and familiar in others, because they too understood that gold destroys everything it touches if you let it, and that the greatest catastrophes tend to begin with desire. But Freya was not in Wagner. Frigga was, his version of Frigg, a nagging wife figure who serves as foil to Wotan's ambitions, and the flattening of the goddess into this role is the kind of thing that happens when the 19th century gets hold of older material and runs it through its own anxieties. There is something almost anachronistic in noticing this, in feeling the specific discomfort of a mythology this powerful being rendered into parlor drama, and I almost did not include it, because the anachronism risks pulling us out of the world we have been building, and also because it is a mild injustice compared to what centuries of active suppression did to the tradition before Wagner got near it. But it surfaces here, briefly, like a shadow from a different window crossing the floor, the sense that every tradition's survival involves this kind of transformation, this recomposition into shapes the receiving culture can metabolize, and that something is always lost in the digestion, and that the loss is not final. Consider Kederlek. Wait, that construction. Consider the grief, not the red gold, for a moment, not the amber, the grief itself, as a fact the mythology insists on. Freya weeps for Oath. She wept before the stories were written down. She was weeping when the skalds found her, and she would presumably be weeping after they stopped writing. The weeping is constitutive of her, not an episode in her story, but a continuous condition that runs beneath all the other attributes: the war, the magic, the necklace, the dead, like a basso continuo under more visible melodic lines. The Norse had a theology of loss. Every good thing in their cosmological frame was temporary, not temporary as in impermanent, which is banal, but temporary in the specific sense that they knew the end date and were unable to change it and kept working anyway. The gods knew Ragnarök was coming. They gathered warriors and practiced Seiðr and forged weapons and built alliances, not because these things would prevent the end, but because the doing of them was what it meant to be the kind of thing they were. They would fight at the end, and most of them would die, and this was not a tragedy exactly. It was the shape of existence in a world where the giants are always pressing at the border, and the world tree is always being gnawed at from below. Freya within this frame is not a counterweight to the darkness. She is not the life principle, holding the death principle at bay. She holds both. She chose the dead as well as the living. She taught the magic that could reach into fate as well as the magic that could alter the shape of desire. She wept into the sea, and the world gained amber, and she kept weeping. This is not a comfortable model of divinity. The runestones that survive, thousands of them, raised across Scandinavia to commemorate the dead. The inscriptions in the runic alphabet that Odin gained by hanging do not name Freya often. They name Odin. They invoke Thor. They mention the journey to the other world. But the women who appear in the inscriptions, the mothers and wives who commissioned the stones, the women remembered on stones commissioned by others, they appear in a tradition that had Freya at its origin. The memory of the dead, preserved in stone, carved in the letters that Odin gave the world through sacrifice, maintained by communities who were already converting but had not yet forgotten. This is Freya's function, operating without her name. The way a river shapes a landscape long after the glaciers that carved the original channel have retreated. She is in the graves where the amber beads were found. She is in the high seats from which the Volua, the seeresses, made their prophecies for the communities that fed them and clothed them and listened to what they said. She is in the battle cries and the shield maidens who appear in the sources with enough regularity to suggest a real practice underlying the literary convention. She is in every funeral where someone thought to ask whether the dead warrior had been claimed by the battlefield choosers before Valhalla ever received him. She is in the naming of desire as something with edges, as something with consequences, as something that generates both gold and catastrophe, and that cannot be fully controlled even by the one who embodies it. The warrior's death in Norse theology was not simply a good death, it was an election, a claiming. The Einherjar were not gathered by accident or natural selection. They were chosen, specifically, by a process that had divine authority behind it, and the authority was divided. Odin's choice was for Valhalla. Freya's choice was for Folkvangr. What the sources do not tell us, and this is one of the most interesting silences in the whole mythology, is what the selection criteria were. Did Odin and Freya agree on who they wanted? Did they compete? Was there a sorting principle underlying the division that the sources knew but did not record, or that was never codified because it did not need to be codified? The silence is generative. It suggests a selection process that operated on principles we are not given access to, which is appropriate. The divine choosing the dead is not meant to be transparent to the living, who might otherwise try to strategize their way into one hall over another and miss the point of what they were doing on the battlefield entirely. The point was to fight with everything you had. The choosing was someone else's business. Freya's half of the dead trained in Folkvangr for Ragnarök alongside Odin's half in Valhalla. They were not separated from the eschatological project. The gathering of warriors was always in service of the last battle, which everyone knew would come and most of them would lose. The warriors in Folkvangr were part of the same desperate arithmetic. Could enough defenders be gathered to give the gods a fighting chance at the end? Could the quality of the dead, carefully selected and carefully trained, alter an outcome that the Norns had already woven? The answer, as we have seen, appears to be no. And the gathering happened anyway. The selecting and the training and the hall making and the long patience of the dead in their halls, drinking and fighting and drinking again, waiting for the horn to blow. This is either noble or absurd or both, and the Norse mythology contains all three readings without forcing you to pick one. What does it mean that the goddess of love teaches the god of wisdom the most dangerous magic in the world? It means that the categories were wrong from the beginning. The Norse did not think of Freya as simply the goddess of love. They thought of her as the goddess of desire in its fullest extension, which includes the desire for knowledge, the desire for the dead, the desire for what is lost, the desire for what cannot be kept, the desire for gold, and the desire for the face of someone who keeps leaving and keeps being searched for. Desire in this reading is not a soft emotion. It is the engine of everything, the force that makes the world move, that sends heroes on quests and gods into dark bargains, and goddesses weeping along the shore, searching for what left. And the god of wisdom needed this. Wisdom without desire is just information. Knowledge without the animating force of wanting to know, wanting to be right, wanting to understand, wanting to help or harm or preserve. Knowledge without that is a library in an empty building, impeccably organized and utterly inert. Odin's hunger for knowledge was itself a form of desire, and Freya recognized it and taught him the method by which desire could be channeled into perception, by which wanting to know could be refined into actually knowing, into the trance state where the self's boundaries dissolved and the larger fabric became legible. She was his teacher. He was the Allfather, the king of Asgard, the god who held the fate of the worlds in his one remaining eye, and she was his teacher. This is the real power she carried, and the reason the giants wanted her, and the reason losing her would have cost the gods more than they knew how to calculate. The coda. Let me try to get this right. Freya is not gone, not in the simple sense. She is in the mythology that survived, in the prose Edda and the poetic Edda and the skaldic poetry and the Icelandic sagas, where she appears in corners, in reference, in the way certain characters invoke her without quite naming her. But not only in that sense. She is in every story about a woman who is desired, and who refuses to be merely the object of desire, who continues to have her own agenda, and her own magic, and her own grief, and her own choices, even as everyone around her tries to reduce her to an exchange value, a bride price, a trophy, a goddess of one simple thing. The mythology refused to let her be simple. Every time it seems to narrow her, here she is the love goddess, here she is the sex object, here she is the weeping wife. It adds another facet that complicates the reduction. She was the witch before witchcraft. She was the battle chooser before the battlefield. She was the gold weeper before the gold. She is in the archetype of the warrior who has access to grief, who can kill and mourn, who can claim the dead with one hand and weep for the lost with the other, who does not have to choose between power and sorrow because she understood that they were the same motion in different registers. She is in the amber. This is not poetic. The amber is there, in the museums, in the graves, dug up from the earth, where someone placed it in the hope that its origin story meant something about where the wearer was going. The amber exists. The story of what it is a story about divine grief, productively transformed. And that story is encoded in the material every time you hold a piece of it up to the light. She is in the name of the day. Every Friday that has ever existed, in the languages that preserved it, and most of the Western languages did, in one form or another. Every Friday is her name, her day, the day set aside by the naming tradition for the goddess who carried desire and war and magic and the choosing of the dead. She is in the tradition of the seeress, the völva, the practitioner of Seiðr, who sat at the high seat and listened to the currents of fate and reported back. That tradition was suppressed, its practitioners persecuted through the later medieval period. The same technologies of accusation and execution that would later become the witch trials applied to women who maintained the old practices long after the official religion changed. The practice survived in fragments, in folk magic, in the spinning and weaving imagery that encodes the Norns' function in domestic objects, in the herbal knowledge and the dream knowledge and the specific sensitivity to the currents of what is about to happen that was never fully erased because it was too useful to lose entirely and too distributed to find and destroy completely. She is in the gold that the earth still gives, that comes up out of the ground in flakes and veins where rivers run over old formations, that the rivers carry down from the mountains. The Norse did not actually claim that all gold was Freya's tears. The mythology is not that totalizing about it, but the association between her grief and gold and amber is real within the tradition, and the tradition understood that the world's most valued materials had an origin story that was about loss and love, which is either a beautiful accident of mythological development or a deep truth about value that the Norse encoded at the level of origin story because they understood that everything worth keeping had been paid for by something being lost. The fire at the end of the world, Surtur's fire, burned everything. The earth sank into the sea, and then the earth rose again. The mythology is quite clear about this. It is not a tragedy with no sequel. It is a catastrophe with a continuation, which is different, which requires a different emotional response than tragedy does. Tragedy closes. The Norse end opens onto a green earth, rising waters, unsown grain, an eagle, two humans in a hidden forest who survived and will begin again. Freya, in this continuation, is unspecified. She is the question mark at the edge of the new beginning. The presence, the sources decline to confirm or deny. And this ambiguity, this refusal to close the question of whether she survives and begins again in the new world, is the most honest thing the mythology can offer about her. She was always the figure who exceeded the frame. She came from before the Aesir built their world, and she may have continued after it ended. The frame's end is not necessarily her end, or it is, or the question doesn't have an answer that can be spoken. These are old stories. They were told around fires, in longhouses, where the smoke went up through a hole in the roof, and everyone moved closer to the center when the cold came in from the north. They were told on ships, on the long passages between islands, where the sea was the medium, and the sky was the ceiling, and the horizon was the only measure of distance. They were told in Iceland, where the eruptions came regularly, and reminded everyone that the earth was not stable, not finished, still being made, still capable of fire. They were written down by men who were not sure whether preserving them was scholarship or nostalgia or sin. They were copied by monks with probably complicated feelings about the whole project. They were rediscovered by 19th century romantics who wanted them to mean things about national identity that the original tellers had not intended, and which have been used since for purposes that would have bewildered and horrified the original skalds. They were translated into English and German and French and Japanese and Korean, and they survive in those translations in a form that is imperfect and partial, and still somehow present, still functional, still capable of doing what myths do, which is to give large things small enough shapes to fit in a story, and then to let the story do the work of keeping those large things present in the minds of people who otherwise would not know how to hold them. Freya is alive in this sense. Not literally. The gods are not coming back. The halls of Asgard are not preparing for the winter feasting season. The Bifrost is not currently operational. The mythology is a mythology, which means it is a body of human meaning-making that uses the forms of the supernatural to say true things about the natural, about desire, about power, about grief, about the choosing of the dead, about what is owed and what can never be repaid. But in that sense, as a living body of meaning, still functional after more than 1,000 years of transmission and transformation, she is alive. She is choosing. She is searching. She is weeping gold into the sea. She is on the high seat, looking further into the weave than anyone else around her, and what she sees, she is not fully telling. She never was. Good night, wherever you are. Keep a light on. The stories travel in the dark,